Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
From time to time on this program, we interview authors, and today we're very privileged to be interviewing an author who is extremely distinguished and has a very, very large number of publications. We welcome to the program Dr. Ivan Deutsch, who is born and grew up in Montana. I believe he now lives in the Seattle area. He holds a BS degree and a master's both from Northwestern University in the field of journalism, and he also has a PhD from the University of Washington in the field of history. As we go through this program today, you will see some excerpts from his works and what a distinguished literary accomplished person he is. Welcome to our program.
Thanks, Tony.
Very pleased to have you here, and I'm pleased to have our regular panelist, Erna Reinhardt, who's the Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and my very good friend and visiting panelist, has been here both as a guest and panelist before, Dr. Virginia Johnson, who chairs the Communication Fine Arts Department at Idaho College. And I do want to pause to say thank you to the Idaho Humanities Council. They've been our friends for years and have been very supportive of the kind of things that we try to do. And they're responsible for our guest today and also his appearance in Coeur d'Alene this evening. And Dr. Johnson is on the commission. And we very, very thank them very, very much. With that, we will invite Erna Reinhardt to commence the questioning.
Welcome to the show, Ivan. It's a great honor for us to have you on our campus today and to be able to do a TV show with you while you're here. For those people that aren't familiar with your writing, share with us your early days growing up in Montana and what that was like and why that's so important to you.
Well, I'm from a long background of ranch hands, not the people who owned the ranches, but the people who did the work on them for the people who owned the ranches. Both of my grandmothers and my mother were ranch cooks, and my dad was a cowboy sometimes, sheep herder sometimes, and various jobs in between at other times. And so it was quite an itinerant life based on seasons of livestock and haying and so forth. And early on in my life, my mother died, and I was then raised by my mother's mother and my father. And so this three-generational group of us bounced through a lot of situations in Montana where I would board out, as we called it. I'd stay in town with somebody to go to school while my dad and my grandmother were working ranch jobs somewhere. So bounced around a lot, but there were, the constancies of the two of them that I think helped bring me here today.
Excellent.
Virginia?
Great. Can you tell us, besides your background growing up in Montana, what some of the major influences have been on you as a writer? Your family, obviously, Montana, teachers, books you've read, any particular ones?
Well, I've learned to read before I went to grade school in Virginia. I've always had my nose into words. In the very early days, it was comic books, I have to say, but it was also things like Life magazine and the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's, those old magazines of the time. And so words have always held me, always fascinated me. And by the time I got to high school, really, I was fortunate to fall into the hands of one of those brilliant, eccentric teachers of English, and Frances Tiedemann was quite an influence on me. She's one of those teachers who, I took 4 years of English from her, 2 of Latin. She handled the yearbook, the school play. Everywhere I turned around during a high school day, there was the influence of this learned teacher, and I'm sure she helped steer me towards a living in words.
So do you have favorite books?
I have many. I have trillions of favorite books. Back in college, one of the oddities, I'm sure this wouldn't happen at Northern Idaho here, but one of the oddities of my college career at Northwestern was that I went from a small high school, 100 students total in the high school, to Northwestern University, a Big Ten school. And my high school grades looked so good on paper that I was, as they called it then, pro'd out, I guess probationed out of English. I didn't have to take any English classes in college. I took a few electives. I was taking journalism all the time. But I began doing a lot of reading on my own. And so Faulkner, I read on my own, Isaac Dinesen, George Orwell. There was a kind of a secondary shelf of books on my big desk in my little college room that were my own English course. So those were the basics back then.
Dr. Johnson used to chair the English department. She would have never allowed you to have done that at North Idaho College. Get out of English.
Wasn't I lucky?
She was tough. We're going to talk about some of your publications, and I am so intrigued with your book, This House of Sky, Landscapes of a Western Mind, and I have one comment to make, and then in a minute I'm going to ask the staff just put this up, so we'll just go through it now. If you'll take us through a series of your books briefly.
Okay. This House of Sky, my first book, a remembrance of growing up in Montana and the lives of my my father and grandmother in that ranch life we talked about.
Yes. And we're going to have several other books up. The next one will come up now.
Sea Runners, this is my first venture into fiction. It's an escape story set in the middle of the 19th century. It involves 4 characters escaping from Russian Alaska in 1853 and aiming for Astoria by canoe, by stolen Indian canoe in 1853. This is the only one that has had the movie rights bought, although the movie hasn't shown up.
Oh, I'm sure it will.
Inside This House of Sky, a collaboration with a Seattle photographer, Duncan Kelso, who came to me, said, I have photos of all your home country in Montana. Can't I do a book with you? And well, here it is. And so these are black and whites, dramatic shots of my growing up country.
Oh, it's one of the beautiful places in the world.
In south central Montana.
Yeah, it's just an incredible country.
Right. English Creek, a book in the so-called Montana trilogy. This novel is set in 1939 with a narrator named Jick McCaskill, who's coming of age that summer, just on the brink of World War II, and it begins the series of the next of the trio of books we're going to see. Next one here, Dancing at the Rascal Fair, is a homesteading novel. It goes back to Montana's entrance into the Union in 1889. It's roughly a 30-year story. My books often have an arc of time. This one had 30 years in it of people coming from Scotland to homestead here in the American West. And the final one of the Montana trilogy, Ride With Me, Mariah, Montana. Mariah is Mariah McCaskill, photographer for a Missoula newspaper, and this book takes place 100 years after Dancing at the Rascal Fair began, and during Montana's centennial, that great northern tier centennial of statehood in 1989.
Our next one here.
Next one, Mountain Time, a book that is not part of the trilogy. This is a book, again, set in Montana, but it's a book really about a father and son contention, people across the generations trying to come to grips with each other.
And we have one final book here.
And this is the most recent one into print, although I've finished another book since this, but this is Prairie Nocturne, a book about motives, really. 3 leading characters, one of them an African-American ranch hand who wants to become a singer. And the other 2 characters, one of whom beautifully pictured here on the cover, their motives in helping him. Does it matter if their motives are good or not?
On that note, I want to ask I'm going to make a couple of comments and get you to react to it, and then back to the panel. In reading This House of Sky, it's just a marvelous book. You are able to do what some authors do and others don't. After doing this show for in the 34th year. One of your great gifts is that when you're reading along, you have the power through the words to bring us back to that period. I felt like I was there. As you described certain things on the ranches and all, or in your life and your family, I felt like I'd gone back. It's a tremendous gift. The second point I want to make, and then get your reaction to these two things, is a great gift. In an article that was published today about you, you talked about you're like an artist that as you use a pencil to do your first writing, it comes off the fingers. It just happens. And the other final thing is that you're so detailed that in your characters, you're even concerned about how they walk and all.
Yeah.
That's just an incredible gift.
Well, it's what I do all day long. I don't teach. I don't hold any other jobs other than being a writer, and I've always seen myself for a good many years now as a professional writer, and so these are the sorts of things I spend my time working at, trying to think of exact words, and the historical and journalistic background help in digging out details and trying to remember what people wear, and Mariah McCaskill. I had earring consultants, teenage daughters of a friend, because I thought, well, Mariah is the kind of who would wear all kinds of earrings. Where can I get all kinds of earrings?
Well, see, that shows your incredible imagination and your detail. It's wonderful. Erna Reinhardt.
Ivan, I'm interested in how did you know that you were going to be a writer? I know as a parent of young adult, it's an interesting process to try to watch them figure out what it is that they want to pursue in their life. So when did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
Well, I aimed myself towards a journalism major in college, sometime late in high school there. I mean, I went off to Northwestern. I forget what people are called when they don't have to declare their majors, but I wasn't one of those. I was aiming directly for what by all reputation and description was one of the top 3 journalism schools in America. And that time I was aiming to be either Tony or Edward R. Murrow, whichever prototype came along first.
I've never been so honored.
I went back there as aiming to be a radio TV journalist, and various turns in life, primarily going into the military and so forth, meant that I came out why print jobs were what were available, and I've been in print ever since. So it was a very deliberate decision to go back there and work at the news. It turns out the news is the news of invented characters sometimes now, or people I've met in the West or whatever, but I hope in the long stretch of things it's still news.
Virginia.
Well, this is a question that I have, and I think it comes right out of what you just said. Can you tell us how much or to what extent the characters that you develop are based on people that you've known, including yourself? None.
Very little.
Yeah.
I make these characters up. Once in a great while, I will give a character something that has happened to me. I notice in my last book or two, my heroes have knee problems, and that comes on my own knees talking to me occasionally. But the characters are made up from dossiers I build of how people talk and what they look like. I mean, I may pick up a hairstyle from someone on a street, something like that, but it'll go on a file card and ultimately to a character. And so there's there's hardly any conscious drawing on people I know. I mean, I took the job as writing fiction quite literally, to me, make the stuff up. Mm-hmm. In the nonfiction books, of course, it's exactly the opposite. Right. This House of Sky and Hard Earth and Winter Brothers, my 3 nonfiction books, those are all excruciatingly detailed, from tape recordings I've made with people, a historical record if they're not alive, photos. One of the troves I did have from this family who didn't leave much written behind them were photo albums, Virginia. My grandmother packed around 3 or 4 photo albums out of the family, so I've ended up with about 500 of these black and white brownie box cameras out of my family's past and the past of the people they encountered in Montana and so forth. So there's a lot of period detail there. And I was on the phone this morning with my publisher. A book called Hard Earth is being reissued, and it's largely looks at my mother's life. A portrait of her on horseback in the 1920s against the Montana rimrock. She's wearing my dad's chaps that are borrowed, and down the side of the chaps in these big silver spangles it says M-O-N-T-A-N-A and a big heart at the bottom. So these kinds of details go into the writing and sometimes onto the book covers.
I want to ask my next question about the House of Sky. For those who have not seen this book, it's in Montana, you're growing up, and as you said at the beginning of the program, your family worked as ranch hands on these. Your mother died at a young age for you and for her too. Tell us a little bit more about what is in the book concerning and what your father, how he had a lot of influence encouraging you to go to college, but talk about the challenges of being a rancher in Montana in those days and any actually experience you had too in that work.
Yeah. Well, we were always fighting the weather. And I think that's probably a fairly common Western experience. I see nods around the table here. Apparently Idaho has weather too.
The winter time can be rough.
Yeah, winters are notably rough here, I know too. And so in our running livestock on shares, as we did, we were kind of the Western version of sharecroppers. Often we were defeated by the weather, whether a spring blizzard might hit us during lambing time, or cold weather during shearing, whatever. And so we were constantly, trying to spin ahead of the weather somehow. And that always kept us without very much money ahead. We always had our muscles, and particularly my dad's smarts as a foreman. He was often hired as a ranch foreman. He was kind of a top sergeant for ranchers and so forth. So we always had those kinds of wherewithal, but by the time I was looking to go off to Northwestern, which still is up there in the tuition ranks with Harvard, Yale, Princeton, whatever, I had to have thank goodness, a total free ride and tuition and a board job and a cheap place to live, and we still had to scrape to have the train fare to get me back there. So, living pretty close to the edge.
And I really recommend this book because that really all comes out. I'm going to skip Erna and come back to Erna. Time is of essence, but I know Virginia is going to have him to read something, and that I would love for our authors to read from their work so the viewers can hear that tone.
Yeah. We talked about a passage earlier, Ivan, that if you would please read to us from this House of Sky.
Okay. Well, we'll just go all out and read the title section, I guess. So, in the night, in mid-dream, people who are entire strangers to one another sometimes will congregate atop my pillow. They file into my sleeping skull in perplexing medleys. A face from grade school may be twinned with one met a week ago on a rainforest trail in the Olympic Mountains. A pair of friends I joked with yesterday now drift in arguing with an editor I worked for more than 1,000 miles from here. How thin the brain walls must be, so easily can acquaintanceships be struck up among these random residents of the dark. Memory, the near neighborhood of dream, is almost as casual in its hospitality. When I fix my sandwich lunch in a quiet noon, I may find myself sitting down 30 years ago in the company of the erect old cowboy from Texas, our neighbor Walter Badgett. Forever the same is the meal with Walter, fried mush with dark corn syrup and bread which Walter first is toasted and then dried in the oven. When we bite, it shatters and crashes in our mouths, and the more we eat, the fuller our plates grow with the shrapnel of crumbs. After the last roaring bite, Walter sits back tall as two of the 10-year-old me and asks down, "Well, Ivan, reckon we can make it through till night now?" I step to the stove for tea and come instead onto the battered blue enamel coffee pot in a sheepherder's wagon. My father's voice now saying, "You could float your grandma's flat iron on the Swedes' coffee." I walk back toward my typewriter, past a window framing the backyard fir trees of Seattle. They are replaced by the wind-leaning jack pines of one Montana ridgeline or another. I glance higher for some hint of the weather, and the square of air broadens and broadens to become the blue expanse over Montana rangeland, so vast and vaulting that it rears from the foundation line of the plains horizon to form the walls and roof of all of life's experience that my younger self could imagine, a single great house of sky.
Thank you.
Just so powerful, isn't it? Erna?
You want to follow up?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Tell us what it is that you would give, what kind of advice do you give aspiring writers?
Well, to write every day if they possibly can, whether it's journal or whatever kind of gadgets they're carrying strapped to their bodies at the moment. That'll do too, I guess. But it should be some kind of coherent form with some attention to providing a narrative with some details of their life. If they're keeping a diary or journal of what they're going on now, they should not simply put down their mood so that 20 years later they look back and it reads, "Gee, I was depressed today." I should say, I had to pay over $2 today for a Starbucks coffee or something like that. There should be the kinds of details that are going to mean something to you on down the line. And so that's the kind of thing I would say, learn the habit of regular writing.
Great.
We have a lot of viewers in different states throughout the Northwest and in Canada, and I always think about them. And so I know a number of them would like to see some of your works and read your works. Mm-hmm. I know one of the publishers you use is Harcourt. Could you share with our viewers how they best can, in a very efficient way, get your books?
Well, there's a full listing of the books and the publishers on my website. That would be ivandoig.com.
Let's do that again for those who might have been getting a pencil or something.
Yeah. It's simply ivandoig.com. www.ivandoig.com.
And they've put it up on the screen.
Yeah, and so everything is still in print, right. And all 10 books are out there available from. How does Stuart McLean say it in Canada from sensible booksellers everywhere, I think.
So. There are a lot of those. Yeah. The other thing I want you to do is to talk a little about your book that just come out that we didn't have a copy of, or we didn't have.
Well, it's not out yet. It's on its way out. It's a book called The Whistling Season, which will be out this coming spring. And it's a book, again, about teachers and students and so forth. It's set in a one-room school here in the West, mostly in 1910. And so I had quite a lot of fun writing about this homestead area school where the 36 kids all come on horseback to those old-fangled schools. So you have this
with one teacher.
Yeah, with one teacher, 8 grades. How about that?
That's called a Renaissance teacher.
Yeah, is that a Renaissance teacher these days? So, yes. And of course, a mysterious stranger rides into town. A new teacher comes to this school as part of the plot.
Oh, that sounds so intriguing. Virginia.
Oh, I just have so many questions. But the passage you read, I think, demonstrates to some extent a phrase that you've used to talk about your writing, and that is aiming to get at the poetry under the prose. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how you do it? One of the things I've observed in your books is how many figures of speech you use mm-hmm. as an element of the writing, which is so powerful, and avoiding cliches. But mm-hmm. how do you get at that?
Well, I sometimes will deliberately resort to poetic rhythms. Sea Runner's book, there's rhythm in there I know, which whose woods these are. I think I know. You know, you could translate people who walk about the streets at night, and so there's occasionally something like that in there. I've never been daunted, although I try to be reasonable about it. I've never been daunted about the difference between verbs and nouns. And so early in This House of Sky, you find a piece of the earth, knolls up, K-N-O-L-L-S, a noun which takes life as the little piece of earth is meant to, and suddenly rises to you. And I've always tried to also, Virginia, have a kind of a shimmer behind what I'm doing in the way my characters talk. And so that's, capturing the language of the people of the West. And it goes into notebooks that I always carry with me, or I've done it by tape recorder, constant reading. But I pay great attention to how people talk. And particularly, I write a lot about people in some kind of definite occupation.
I'm going to interrupt because we don't have much time, and there's something we're going to bring in some footage because you're speaking to students. Tell us a little about how you deal with students and on your visits and the role of what you can do for students.
Well, about all I can do is stand up there and try to talk about using the language a little bit, it seems to me, because student language is very vivid. We know that. This goes back to the shimmer of language of people in any kind of occupation. And students are very vivid about, creating their generational language, which often lasts just a matter of days before something else goes on.
It does change.
And it does change. And I think this is something they can consciously do, is to try catch the language of their own time.
You're presenting today to over 1,000 students. We're grateful
so
for that.
Told.
On the program, I have to bring it to conclusion, but Dr. Johnson, I want you, she's vice chair of the Idaho Humanities Council, and please tell the council how grateful we are that you've shared through them our guests today at this program, and to the students in Coeur d'Alene, and of course to a banquet tonight. And they're a wonderful staff. Rick Artage and the staff, they're remarkable in what they do. We're very proud of the Idaho Humanities Council. And so thank you again, and please share that with them. Thank you for being our guest.
You bet. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've enjoyed our program immensely, and we'd invite you to be with us again this same time next week when we'll interview on another subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.